Now, to discuss David Cameron's dilemma are Sir Malcolm Rifkind MP, who, as John Major's Foreign Secretary in the 90s, remembers all too well the party's battles over Europe, and also Nadine Dorries, a Conservative MP who doesn't yet bear those sort of scars. Can I ask you three very simple questions first off? Do you firstly believe that David Cameron will go to this meeting and defend British interests?
To an extent.
Do you want the euro to survive?
I think it's time for the euro to be dismantled in an orderly way.
And were the member states of the euro to decide they didn't agree with you, they wanted it to survive and came to some arrangement between themselves about coordinating tax and the like, that would be all right or not?
No, then it's time for a referendum.
Right. Okay. On that third point, which seems a quite likely outcome if the Merkel-Sarkozy letter is put into effect, it would change the game, wouldn't it?
Well, not in the sense that is being implied. Let's be very straightforward as to where we are. Europe is in an incredibly fragile state. If the European summit collapses on Friday because of an inability to reach agreement, that is very serious, not just for the rest of the Eurozone countries, for Britain as well. Now, that means that the tough approach required from David Cameron is perfectly reasonable if he concentrates on issues relevant to this crisis, such as the potential threat to the City of London. If he makes that a condition for his consent, then he is entitled to be as tough as required. But if we were to have debates and discussions on Friday about whether we should repatriate the common fisheries policy or the working time directive or matters of that kind, the rest of the world would be aghast if the European economy was veered towards collapse.
You're snorting over there,
well,
Nadine
I'm afraid
Dorries.
Malcolm is falling into the trap of defending the outrageous claims, the worst case scenarios. Actually, Malcolm, all we need to do to defend the city from the transaction tax is to say no. That's all we need to do. So all this flim and flam about the Prime Minister he's going to defend, he's going to come back on Friday waving a white flag with prosperity in our time on it because he's been and defended the city, and this will be the story which comes back. But the Prime Minister has been and he saved the city. Well, there is no saving to be done. We just say no. We won't have the transaction tax. So that's not the issue.
If he does that, he's looking after British interests, isn't he, by his own lights?
Well, he could do that in 30 seconds. The big issue is, which needs defending and debating, is whether or not there is going to be a euro zone, a bloc of 17 countries. If there are, and that's what's decided, and we are part of the 27th, the outer ring, then that inner union will affect our economy, and that will be bad for us. And that's what we want him to defend. We want him to defend us from that happening. And if that is going to happen,
the 17.
Well, there is only one outcome for us. If the 17 have a union and there are one bloc, and let's admit, let's just face it, 2 of the countries have already been taken over by technocrats. We need that point to have a referendum because the British people have had no say on this.
I'm so sorry.
What
Malcolm Rifkind can speak for
it will affect us.
Let him get a word in.
There is a fundamental gap with the real world in what we're being told. The reality is that no one country, whether it's the United Kingdom or any other country, can simply dictate to all the rest. Even the Germans can't do that. They have to get agreement from their allies. So the idea that David Cameron goes to a summit and says, I am going to veto this summit, this agreement that everybody else wishes to go forward on, regardless of the implications for the European economy, regardless of the reactions of the markets, including our interest rates, as well as those in other countries, unless you give me concessions on matters that are not relevant to this immediate European crisis. We all know perfectly well that if there is to be a repatriation of powers, that is going to be a lengthy negotiation, even if it was successful. I was Margaret Thatcher's Europe minister. It didn't come much tougher than Margaret Thatcher. When Margaret Thatcher went into a negotiation, she never made unrealistic demands. She never said, I insist on this regardless of the consequences for the British economy, never mind your own economies. What she said was, she identified what was deliverable. And what's deliverable on Friday is agreement on dropping this ridiculous transfer tax. What is deliverable on Friday is an understanding that there are other issues important to the United Kingdom, which may need to be considered. Angela Merkel has already been quoted as saying that she would be willing to give constructive consideration to the kind of changes on the market, on the employment directive that David Cameron's been raising. So you've got to be negotiating in a sensible, practical way, not just saying, I demand this, I demand that, regardless of the consequences. That's not the real world we live in.
When you have already made the statement that if there is to be any further loss of sovereign power or power to Europe, then we will have a treaty, or
That's
a treaty,
law.
we will
That is the
have
law.
a referendum. And we are now in that position,
No, we're
because if there is a bloc of 17 countries in a union, that will impact on us and on our economy, and will bring about changes to our economy, and therefore we have to have a referendum. You know, people out there in 1973 voted for a common market. They did not vote to be part of a two-tier Eurozone where 17 countries in effect become one country, and we are on this outer ring. They did not vote for that.
The act that you and I voted for, and is now the law of the land, says if the United Kingdom government proposes to surrender or transfer sovereignty to Europe in any new area, there must be a referendum. That is not what is being proposed on Friday. If those countries that are in the Eurozone, which are only 17 of the 27, if they wish to transfer more of their power to Brussels, that's their
This
De
is a new
facto change of power within the European Union is something people should surely be allowed to
I'm not
vote
saying these aren't important issues. I'm saying the obligation to have a referendum is not whenever there's any change of any kind in Europe.
But
It is if there is a surrender of sovereignty by, or a desire to surrender sovereignty by a British government. That was
Jeremy,
what
this
Parliament
is a-
voted for.
Very
This is
quickly.
a new situation. The 17 countries becoming one unit is very new. This is
They
something
already
which
are
is...
a union. They're in a
this
single
is-
currency.
This is something which is... But what is being proposed is very different. This hasn't been on the table before. This is almost going through at a speed which people can't even begin to understand what's happening. I mean, even the use of the word sovereign, Malcolm. My constituents say to me, what does that mean? When they're told it actually means a transfer of our powers to somebody else being able to make some of our powers and dictating our policy, they don't like the sound of that. And this is all moving ahead very fast. What we need to do is to say, we need to acknowledge what people want
Yes, but
and
it's
give
very
them the
important for the
referendum.
people like yourself not to mislead the public and imply that something which is not
Misleading the
Forgive me,
public
let me
is-
finish the sentence. Not to imply that something which is not a transfer of British sovereignty is nevertheless in
Okay.
practice exactly that.
All right,
That
well-
is not a proper way to try and take this debate
We shall
forward.
know what we're talking about in a day or so, and if the euro collapses, it may all be irrelevant anyway.